thank y'all. This won't be that long, actually. And all I'm going to tell you about, it's not much as to make a case for taking the vaccine as much as what it is. That's my main goal, is so you understand what it is and what it's not. So a little bit of terms. A lot of people get confused what COVID-19 is and what SARS-CoV-2, those two terms. COVID-19 is actually the disease. It's not the name of the virus. It's the fever, the shortness of breath, the body aches, the nausea, the vomiting, the cough, the loss of smell. That's actually the disease. It stands for Coronavirus Disease 2019 because this was first identified in China December the 30th, 2019. So it was named from that. So COVID-19 is the name of the disease, not the virus. The virus is named SARS-CoV-2. And y'all have seen pictures of on the internet with the little red dots and all that representing the virus. And that SARS-CoV-2 stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. I have to look to remind myself that one myself. But anyway, we call it SARS-CoV-2. And the reason the 2 is there is because this has actually happened before at a smaller scale back in 2002 in several countries, and they called that one SARS. So this was called SARS-CoV-2. So just a few terms. Next, I got to do a little basic biology to understand the vaccine. There's a few little things you need to understand that will make this go well, so I'm going to review just a little bit of biology. And just for a scale, that's the size of a virus in relation to a human cell, that little dot there. Just so when I show you the virus and it's what it's made of, just to put it to scale, our cells are much larger than a virus. Viruses are very small. Anyway, this is a human cell. It could be a cell in your brain, a cell in our lungs, sinuses, skin, mouth, anywhere. All cells have basically the same structure. You've got this covering right here, which is the cell membrane. In the middle is our nucleus. That's where all your genes are. That's where the DNA is that makes you you. The color of your eyes, hair, or lack of hair. It's what makes you you. And then everything between the membrane and the nucleus is the cytoplasm. And the best way to look at that is that's our cell's factory. It's what does the work. And then another thing to know is that the DNA is the chemical name for our genes. That sits in the nucleus. Every one of your cells has an exact copy of the DNA that's a hybrid of your mom and dad. And that stays static. That's what makes you you. And the way that instructions your genes is converted to you is that's converted to something called RNA in your nucleus that goes out into the cells. And then that's converted to proteins, which are the proteins of your body. And that's how that works. Next is what is a virus. Now it's much smaller. I've just magnified it, so keep that in mind. A virus is really simple. It's not even living. It's all it is this coating right here you see, that little envelope, which is made of proteins and fats. And then on the surface, you'll see these little spikes. They're often little protein spikes. And inside the virus is its genetic structure. It's either the DNA or RNA. And there's DNA viruses and there's RNA viruses. Examples of the DNA viruses is like hepatitis, chickenpox, hepatitis B. A lot of y'all have had the hepatitis B vaccine. That's a DNA virus. The reason you don't get that one again, DNA viruses don't change like RNA viruses do. RNA viruses are like flu, coronavirus, Ebola. They mutate a little bit more. The one we're talking about today, the SARS-CoV-2, is a coronavirus. It's an RNA virus. Now, by itself, a virus can't hurt you. If it sits out here in the air, just sitting there, there's no poison in it. There's nothing that can hurt you. It's not like a bacteria that can harm you. There's nothing it can do as long as it's not in our body. It does nothing. There's no poison inside the virus. There's nothing it can reproduce. The only way it can reproduce, it has to get in our body, get in our cells, and hijack our cytoplasm, our factories, to do its business. Outside our bodies, it does nothing. Okay? Now, SARS-CoV-2, just like any other virus, has that little envelope made of protein and fat. And everybody's seen these little red dots. Those are called spike proteins. The reason I come back to it and draw it, the spike protein is important to understand what the vaccine does, and that's why I mentioned it, and you'll see that in a minute. And then in the middle, you've got 29 strands of RNA that codes for 29 different proteins. In contrast, each of our human cells has codes for thousands, millions of proteins. Much more complex than a simple virus. This virus only codes for 29 proteins, or basically the codes for the structures to make more of it and the instructions on how to make that. Okay, so now let's talk about how the disease happens. And I'm just going to use a fictitious case similar to some patients I've seen. Let's talk about a patient, John, around Thanksgiving. He's sitting around the Thanksgiving table. His son's just come home from college. His son has SARS-CoV-2 in his body, but he's not yet having symptoms. He's going to develop symptoms 2 days later on Saturday, but he's still expressing the virus. It's in the air that they're breathing around the kitchen table. So John's my age, he's sitting there, and he breathes in this virus into his lungs where it attaches to his lung cells. That little spike protein, that little red dot, is actually like a key, and it locks into cells that have the lock on it, which is a lot of our sinus cells, our brain cells, our lung cells. It's like a locking key. As soon as it locks into John's cells, it puts that RNA from the virus into John's lung cells. And then John's lung cells, that cytoplasm, has the factory to make those 29 proteins. So basically the virus is hijacking John's lung cells. Now, what happens from there is John's lung cells makes more of the virus. So more of the virus comes out of that cell to either affect other people. In fact, his wife gets it a few days later from this way. And then other cells, including his cells in his nose that help him breathe, his sinus cells, more of his lung cells, which results in an immune system reaction where he starts getting fever, loss of smell, cough, and all the typical symptoms. And it's really this immune system down here that causes our problems. It's our immune system attacking that virus in our cells to try to get rid of it, sometimes overdoing it, that creates some of the problems, okay? The virus is just trying to reproduce. It's our immune system battling against it that causes a lot of our problems. Okay. Now I've taken you about how the disease happened. I'm going to take you back to last winter when SARS-CoV-2 was first identified by scientists around the world. And based on the technology that exists in the last 20 years that allows forensic scientists and criminologists to figure out who murdered someone, that DNA typing is the same technology that scientists were able to take that SARS-CoV-2 and take that RNA and type it and figure out the formula, what it's made of. It's the same technique. And what they were interested in was scientists wanted to know what part of those 29 little pieces of RNA codes for that spike protein. Because they figured if they make a vaccine against something that would identify that spike protein, it could block attaching to us. And it took them a little bit, but it didn't take long, and they found it, a little bit of strand on this one RNA, and they took it and then they identified it and typed it out, okay? So now they've got the formula for the RNA from the virus that codes for the spike protein. Now, I change and make another slide to make an important point. That RNA that scientists identified that makes the protein, they then manufactured that RNA. It's not taken from the virus, it's actually manufactured. That technology has existed in the past 20 years where scientists can actually in a laboratory make RNA. So they took that formula where they identified it and they made that little bit of RNA and they modified it a little bit. Now, it's important to know that RNA, if a vaccine injected into our body, it won't last longer than me talking. It's very fragile. That's why soap and anything else just destroys it sitting on anything. So it has to be put in something like that's called a nanoparticle, a little envelope, much like the virus, to protect it before it can be given into your arm. And that brings up these two companies. Pfizer and Moderna had both different ways of making that little soap bubble, I call it, nanoparticle. Pfizer had a certain way of making it, Moderna had a certain way of making it. Both companies, it's basically fats, salts, and sugars that make up that little nanoparticle. But the result of it is that's why Pfizer has to be stored at such a lower temperature, because its little soap bubble is more fragile. It has to be stored at a lower temperature, and Moderna's stored at more typical freezer temperatures. So that's all the vaccine is. It's just a little bit of nanoparticle soap bubble and a little strand of RNA versus the full virus. And it's not obtained from the virus. It's actually all this stuff right here is man-made. Okay, now how does that help you? So last Friday, I got my second dose of the Pfizer vaccine. So I have Pfizer's little soap bubble there with a little bit of that RNA, thousands of those little soap bubbles, and a little bit of half cc in a syringe injected into my arm. Once it gets in my arm, those little nanoparticles get in my blood, and the first thing that happens, they see this guy. This guy's one of my little white cells called a macrophage. It's basically like a little Pac-Man or blob. It eats up things that are not us. So my white cells take in that little RNA, and then my white cells have the same machinery that all my other cells do. They can turn RNA into protein. So they take that RNA and turn it into those little spike proteins. And this is where the vaccine stops in our body. It doesn't go any further than this. In fact, our immune system, actually in just a few days, destroys all that. But in the process of destroying it, it's forming memory to what that spike protein looks like. So that next week, or well, it's not next week, let's say 3 weeks from now, if I run into somebody with COVID-19, symptomatic or non-symptomatic, and I start breathing in that virus particles, before it can attach to my lung cells, my immune system has already recognized that spike protein and attacks it to prevent it from coming into me. And that's how the vaccine works. Now, I've taken you to last July. All this science and work was to last July. That's just on paper. But nothing's good on paper unless you actually show it and prove it in real time. And these trials you've been hearing about on that this past November, December, about the efficacy of the vaccines started last July. And they started with about 30,000 people, volunteers, in the Pfizer and about 30,000 people in the Moderna trial. These are 30,000 people that volunteered to be guinea pigs. They either take the real vaccine or the fake one, but not knowing which one they're going to get. Okay? That's how the phase 3 trials work. And it's blinded. In other words, the person getting the shot last summer, they don't know if they're getting the fake or the real one. The nurse or the doctor that's giving it to their arm don't know if they're giving the real one or the fake one. That's the way this science works. The only ones that know who's getting what is the mathematicians and the statisticians. They keep up with what happens over the ongoing months. So that little first green dot is in July, and that 110 days at the bottom is somewhere around the end of October, because these studies started getting reported in November. Now, these studies are now going all the way into January, still going, so they're about 6 months into it. So that's how the trials were set up. And about 15,000, half of them were randomized to get the fake one. And the ones that got the fake one, this is what happened to those folks. You can see this little line going up. It's obviously they didn't get the real vaccine. So as the mathematicians follow those folks over the ensuing months, no surprise, you saw more and more cases over that time. Now, the other groups in both the Pfizer and Moderna got the real vaccine. Now, what they found there was the interesting thing. About the first 10 days, nothing happened. So the people who got the real vaccine versus the people who got the fake, they both got COVID at the same rate. But about day 10 to 14 in the study, it curved and separated until today. It's still pretty flat. And that's where they came up with this 95% effective that you see. It's based on the math of this. And so between the ones that got the vaccine versus the one that got the fake, it's 95% effective about preventing any degree of COVID-19, whether it's mild or severe. But the really only thing us clinicians really care about is the severe stuff. What they found in the ones that got the real vaccine that still got COVID, none of them, or maybe one, I think one in the Pfizer, none in the Moderna got severe disease. When I say severe disease, I mean hospitalization, respiratory failure, death, those kind of things. So even if you got sick, it's more like just a cold or flu or stay home kind of stuff. So that was results there. Side effects. I had this one, and this one on the first shot that lasted about a day or two. On average, the side effects last about a day or two. They usually occur about a day or two after the shot. A little bit more common, a little bit more severe with the second. Although my second shot last Friday, I barely had even any fatigue. Now, I had some of my partners that got their second shot of Pfizer last Friday. A couple of them had fever, headache, and were in the bed for about a day. But it only lasts a day or two. So if you get the shot, you kind of need to plan about the what ifs. I kind of chose when I got my shot last week I had shoulder surgery, so I was already down anyway. And when I got my first shot was a Friday, so I didn't have to worry about working the next day. So I kind of planned for that, although it didn't turn out to be any issues. In fact, 2 days after my first shot, I was able to go out and buy it. These side effects, is important to know though, is basically that slide where I show you where that vaccine gets in your arm and your immune system is attacking it and breaking it down. This is your immune system. These symptoms are your immune system remembering that spike protein. They're not adverse reactions. In fact, I was actually disappointed why I didn't have a lot of symptoms. I was actually wanting more symptoms. I wanted to know I was getting immune. In fact, this last Friday when I had my second shot, I hardly had any symptoms. I said, I don't know if it's taking effect or not. So I had taken some blood from myself with the first shot back in December, and my antibodies were, of course, negative for SARS-CoV-2. And then I took blood work on myself last Friday, the day I got my second shot, which is 3 weeks after my first, and I had turned positive for antibodies against the spike protein, so I felt better. So anyway, the side effects are common. They're to be expected, but they're very short-lived. And this conclusion, I made this slide early on. I spent a lot of time going through all the papers that were reported from Pfizer and Moderna to the FDA. I went through all the studies myself and pulling all this that I'm showing y'all today myself from all the studies that were using to approve these vaccines. I actually streamed the subcommittee meetings. I spent about 10 hours of my time just going through it because I like doing it. And this is my conclusion from my assessment of all the studies, not just the FDA telling me. Both of them are equally effective. In fact, they're about 95% effective on the Moderna and Pfizer. And the reason I tell you that, it don't matter which one you get. We're going to do Moderna at the office, but I got Pfizer because it was the first one offered to me, but it really doesn't matter which one you get. The only thing that matters, if you get Pfizer, your second shot has to be Pfizer. If you get Moderna, the second shot has to be Moderna. That's the only thing that matters. They're safe in the population studies. They only studied over 16 to 18 according to which company, and that's by design. Typically when new science is applied to people, they don't start with the kids first. Right now there's studies looking at the under 16 to under 18, but they won't know till maybe summer or fall if it's safe and effective for that group. Also, pregnancy was ruled out. Anybody wanted to sign up for the studies, if they were pregnant, they were not accepted. However, stuff happens. People did get pregnant during the studies, about 25 in each study. Not enough to conclude anything safety or efficacy, but they're following those along. I know some physicians that are pregnant elected to go ahead and get the vaccine, but we can't really say officially it's okay. It's not a contraindication, however. And then lastly, the side effects are common but mild and short-lived. A little bit about how COVID spreads. This is why it's important. The vaccine, for most clinicians, is not important at an individual level, but as that herd immunity. And I was going to explain that. This 1.5 I've got right here is currently, with all the pros and cons of mitigation and masking and separation and closing, all that stuff across this country, has resulted in less spread. In fact, I looked these up, it's about 1.5 steady. That means that one person that gets sick, on average, spreads it to 1.5 other people. That's including those that don't spread it very well versus the super spreaders. All that across the country is about 1.5. But before mitigation, back if you look at Washington data, New York, China, Italy, the virus in its natural state will spread to 5 people. That's why all this concern. So one person that gets sick will spread it to 5. Those 5 people each will spread it to 5, and so forth. It's like taking your calculator going 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 times 5. So this 80% herd immunity you're hearing about is basically based upon this 5 here. If you think about it, to keep something from spreading like that, you've got to have 4 out of 5 immune. So this person only spreads it to this person, but not these. And this person here spreads it to this one, but not these. Okay? That's 80% immunity. So how do you get that immunity? You either get it from being sick and immune, or you get it from the vaccine to be immune. So that 80% herd immunity you've been hearing about is based upon the math of this. Okay? So this is my theory in the next 2 years. Actually, not much theory. That's just what I think is going to happen. In the next 2 years, about everybody's going to either get the virus or the vaccine until that 80% immunity happens. It's estimated about right now, based upon people, you probably, I bet you, and just if you're like our office, about 20% of you have already had it. If you look across the country, about 20% have had COVID-19 already and are immune for at least some period of time. So that's 20% of that 80%. You got me? So that's going to keep creeping up until that 20 becomes 80, or you start adding some over here to it. And so that's why, like, for example, if I could snap my finger right now and make this a 60, that 60 plus 20 would equal 80, and you'd see the curves going down. That's all the math is to it. So this is still going to continue to go up. Hopefully this is going to continue to go up until these 2 numbers are greater than this. Now that new strain that's coming out that's more infectious, it may be a 7. That might mean that this 80%'s got to be 83 or 84% if you look at the math. But it's still going to be close to 80. Okay, you got me? All right, what is not known? That immunity that I just showed you begs the question, say if you get COVID-19, are you immune? How long are you immune? The only thing we can kind of say right now from what we've seen is you're probably immune for 3 months. We can't tell you how long after that. We don't know. And likewise, how long does immunity last after the vaccine? Well, right now, the studies are 6 months into it, so 6 months. That's still going to go on, so that's not known. Will this be something that wanes after a year or 2? But, I mean, another issue is this partial immunity. Maybe the immunity does wear off, okay? But you have some partial immunity. So whether you got the real virus or the vaccine, you got enough partial immunity so you don't get it as bad. I mean, everyone here, whether you know it or not, has had Spanish flu. You don't know this, but you have. Spanish flu has been circulating since 1918. It's part of us. So we all have partial immunity to it. That's why you don't hear about Spanish flu, but it's part of the flu that's around. So it may turn into something like that over time with this partial immunity business. That begs the question, is there a benefit of getting the vaccine even if you've had the COVID-19 before? That's not known either. I know it's safe. A lot of folks are doing it. If I had COVID-19, would I get the vaccine? Yeah. Now, I might not get it right away so someone else could get my dose, but eventually I would. But officially, we don't know the answer to that. And then how about the effectiveness of the vaccine in those under 16? I already alluded to that. That last bit, I've looked a little bit into the severe allergic reactions. In the 2 studies, there were no anaphylaxis. Y'all have all dealt with anaphylaxis. I'm sure you've given epinephrine here and there. But severe reactions like that. In the Moderna and the Pfizer study, there was no anaphylaxis. There have been some, like typical vaccines across the country. Just last week, it's been determined that one of the ingredients in that little nanoparticle in each company has something called polyethylene glycol. It's not a poison, but some folks are allergic to it. So it's not something they're going to take out of it. It's kind of like some people are allergic to peanuts. That doesn't make peanuts bad. It just means some people can't have peanuts. So if we have anybody with a history of anaphylaxis that checks on that little sheet of paper, we're probably going to postpone their vaccine until we can investigate a little further. Yeah, social media. I pulled up a little social media stuff over what I've been seeing just to address. One is I hear a lot, it changes your DNA. If you paid attention to stuff I was saying before, DNA goes to RNA, goes to protein. It's one way. RNA don't go back to DNA. So the RNA in the virus doesn't change your DNA. The vaccine RNA doesn't change your DNA. It doesn't change anything about your what makes you you. Another thing I've seen a lot is it was produced too fast, and that actually has got some merit. I had to actually ask myself about that one too, until I looked into it a little further. The first one is the technology was already there. I didn't know that. The technology to make vaccines like this, and this is the first one that's actually manufactured RNA. That's not been done before. It's actually been done before, just never applied. It was applied to it was made for SARS for 2002 and MERS of 2003, both coronaviruses. But those little mini pandemics went away, the money went away, and so it didn't go any further. This time, the money's there because that brings up to the second one, that Operation Warp Speed removed a lot of the financial barriers for these companies. And then last, it was actually thought by scientists that in the know from my reading, they didn't think these studies would show efficacy until the spring of 2021. The reason it got there a little quicker is what happened in this past fall across the country, this spike of cases. More and more and more cases, just like and the same apply to these studies. So the statisticians could see separation quicker. So it became statistically significant earlier. So a bad thing, which is the increased rate of infection, resulted in a good thing. The results were able to be reported earlier. And then I've read a lot about, I don't think enough is known about the long-term consequences. There's nothing long-term. The only long-term consequence I have a question about is how long the immunity will last, because the ingredients, that little soap bubble, that little bit of RNA is actually broken down within days. That correlates to the symptoms you have, and there's nothing in it that stays in your body forever. It's just the immunity, we hope, stays in there a long time. And that is it.